Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. On behalf of Asian Development Bank, we wish to extend a warm welcome to all participants attending this COP26 side event on investing in climate resilient biodiversity landscapes and communities. This event is being organized as part of COP26 Resilience Hub. There are almost 100 events focusing on resilience, and this is one of the events. I am Srinivasan Ancha. I work as a Principal Climate Change Specialist in Thailand Resident Mission of the Asian Development Bank, and also serve as a Climate Change Focal for Southeast Asia Department. So just a few notes, for this event will be recorded, as you may have heard. And also kindly post your comments and questions in the chat box. If your query is to a specific panel member, please address so that he or she can respond directly. And please mute your microphone when you are not speaking for the event. And with that, I would like to again warmly welcome all of you. And we hope we will get a lot of insights from our distinguished panel members. Today for this event, we have about 5 panel members. Both from the region and outside the region. First, I would like to introduce Ronald Teraganon. He is the Senior Strategic Advisor at the Regional Community Forestry Training Center for Asia and Pacific, RECOFTS. He has extensive experience in community-based natural resource management for almost 40 years. And also community-based climate change adaptation and mitigation, and also in promoting local people's knowledge and customary rights. Then we have another colleague, Jean-Marc Champagny. He is the head of Environmental Finance and Bankable Nature Solutions, Asia Pacific of WWF Hong Kong. He has substantial experience, more than 17 years experience in the financial industry. And he co-established the Climate Impact Asia Fund. So he's really, a key person in terms of the linking the private sector as well as nature, especially in developing bankable nature solutions. Then we have a colleague from Washington, DC, Dora Cujo. She is the Senior Operations Officer as well as the Program Coordinator for the Forest Investment Program and the dedicated grant mechanisms for indigenous people and local communities. And she is also the coordinator for the newly launched, or being launched actually, Nature, People and Climate Program at the Climate Investment Funds. She is also serving as the Stakeholder Engagement Coordinator at SIF. Then we have Tamar Shaffer. He is the Head of Living Lakes and Conservation at the Global Nature Fund, and he is kindly joining us from Germany now. Then finally, we have my colleague Narayan Iyer. He is the Senior Natural Resources and Agricultural Specialist from the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of ADB. He has extensive experience in agribusiness banking and so the private sector. So before handing it to our panel members to reflect on, I will provide a brief introduction to our event to basically to set the scene and also to show how important is this topic for now and the future. And also for now, when I say for the ongoing climate negotiations in Glasgow, and also for future in terms of future of our entire planet and people. So as most of you know, in the past 3 months, we have heard several declarations and pledges in support of protecting nature, climate, and people. First, there is a Finance for Biodiversity pledge that has almost 75 financial institutions having almost $14 trillion of assets. And they committed to protect and restore biodiversity through their finance activities and investments. In September 2021, actually, this event called Nature for Life Hub, which was attended by 22 presidents and prime ministers, saw 9 organizations and foundations committing about $5 billion over the next 10 years to protect nature, climate, and people. This is a good investment and basically from these foundations and organizations. This is a private initiative actually to support nature. In October, of course, all of you know, we had the Convention on Biodiversity, COP15 in Kunming. The part 1 is completed, but part 2 will be in April and May. And there we received a pledge for about $233 million initially, Kunming Biodiversity Fund. This initiative is launched by People's Republic of China. At the same time, EU also announced doubling of its funding for biodiversity. France has committed that 30% of the climate funds will go to protect biodiversity. UK also announced that a significant part of their climate finance will be directed towards biodiversity. Japan also announced some funds to its own Japan Biodiversity Fund. So these are all several pledges and declarations. And of course, the most important event that is going on now is the COP26. And in the first week itself, it has achieved some major political deal. Now we are into the second and final week of negotiations. On 2nd November, they had something called Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use. And by 5th November, 133 countries have promised to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. And more importantly, the declaration or the pledge includes almost like $19 billion of public and private funds towards nature protection and also helping the communities. So it says that the countries that pledged so far cover almost 85% of the global forest area. And interestingly, more than 30% of the world's biggest financial companies also promised to end investments in activities linked to deforestation. That is a substantial commitment that needs to be monitored. More importantly, this Glasgow Leaders Declaration, point number 3, specifically mentions reducing vulnerability, building resilience, and enhancing rural livelihoods, including through empowering communities, development of profitable, sustainable agriculture, and recognition of multiple values of forests, while recognizing the rights of indigenous people as well as local communities in accordance with the relevant national legislation and international instruments. If we look at the declaration and specifically this point number 3, this is the main topic for our discussion. We are looking at reducing resilience of the ecosystems, but also empowering the communities dependent on those ecosystems. So the declaration is important that way, not only from the point of financing, but also from the point of empowering the indigenous people and local communities, depending on biodiversity resources. So if we look at this pledge of $19 billion, although conventional biodiversity mentioned that we need almost $700 billion per year to protect biodiversity, but still the pledge at Glasgow is very important, especially if we consider the global climate finance flows. So the Climate Policy Initiative recently came up with an estimate that the annual global climate finance in 2019 and 2020 is about $632 billion. But however, they also estimated annual climate finance must increase to $4.13 trillion per year. So we can see, currently we are at 632 billion worldwide, and it should increase to $4.13 trillion by 2030 annually. So of this total climate finance of 632 billion, only 14 billion went to agriculture, forestry, and land use and associated ecosystems. It is just around 2.2%. And of this 14 billion, about 8 billion went to mitigation, 4 billion for adaptation, and 2 billion for multiple activities. So if we see again, out of $632 billion, whole adaptation finance is only $46 billion. Of this, only $4 billion is for the agriculture, forestry, and land use. While the adaptation finance needs are almost about $180 billion per year. So if we look at our sector or biodiversity issues or agriculture, forestry and land use, all that, the adaptation component is so small, only $4 billion. It is less than the total adaptation finance, and which itself is less than around 5% of the total climate finance. So that is why many countries, many parties have welcomed the Glasgow Declaration. However, many also are skeptical because of the previous experience. There was a previous deal in 2014, the New York Declaration on Forests, and 40 countries have committed or pledged support for that declaration. However, the declaration had failed to slow deforestation at all, and also financial commitments did not materialize. So this is something that to watch how this declaration fares in future. And also Article 7 of the Paris Agreement is really talking about global goal on adaptation. So again, adaptation there, I mean, of course, ecosystems are a part of it. So this is where, I mean, global goal on adaptation is aiming at protecting people, livelihoods, and ecosystems. So obviously the resources allocated for biodiversity conservation, climate resilience, etc., need to increase if we really want to achieve that global goal on adaptation. In fact, this second week, we are entering a critical stage in COP26 negotiations. They are going to talk about the adaptation finance as well as Article 6 on carbon markets. So the later issue on Article on carbon 6, Article 6 on carbon markets, this issue has been pending for almost 5 to 6 years since the Paris Accord was signed in 2015. We should remember that both issues are very much interlinked, because the new draft proposals published on Friday, last Friday, showed the countries are still far apart in how to use the revenues generated by the carbon trading. And they also differ on issues such as accounting, because some developing countries are insisting that the proceeds from the carbon trading should go for climate adaptation. And obviously that will benefit, including resilience of the biodiversity landscapes and communities. So if at all an agreement is reached this week, International Emissions Trading Association predicts that it could unleash up to $1 trillion of new capital investment. So that is why all eyes are on this Article 6 approval. And hopefully this will have a lot of implications for protecting biodiversity and helping local communities. So with that background, now I'd like to go to our panel members to ask their insights on various issues that pertaining to this seminar. First, Ron, please. RECOPS has been involved in efforts to improve resilience of both forest ecosystems and biodiversity, and also local communities in Asia for a long time. With your extensive experience for more than 30-40 years, what do you think are the key challenges in Southeast Asia to invest in protecting the biodiversity landscapes as well as local communities dependent on that? And how do you see this latest Glasgow Declaration, and what are its implications for our communities in Southeast Asia? Ron, please.
All right. Thanks a lot, Srini. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies, gentlemen, friends, and colleagues who have similar interests in invest for climate resilience, biodiversity, landscape, and local communities. Well, on behalf of RECOP, we sincerely thanks the ADB for allowing us to share our long experience working to build the resilience of biodiversity forest landscape and the people who depend on them. Why do any investment in climate resilience must have local community involvement? I'd like to reiterate this sentence because Srini start off, talking about the climate finance, why we have to talk about local communities. At RECOP, we believe in a future where people live equitably and sustainably in and besides healthy and resilient forests. So that brings in the human condition. Let me share our finding from our recent research done in 2020. not really long ago. In ASEAN region, we found that 13.8 million hectares are legally managed by communities or smallholders. That is double the size it was in 2010. So you can imagine within 10 years, ASEAN had made a lot of progress in terms of getting a number of hectares are legally managed by local communities. Why is that? If ASEAN member states reach their target in 2030 for communities or social forestry, be aware most of the ASEAN member states, they set the target to get the huge amount of hectares to be managed by local communities or smallholders. They set the target at 2030. If they reach the target, local communities will manage a combined area of more than 30 million hectares. That would be nearly 5% increase since 2010. I give you some example. In Cambodia, villagers patrol their community protected area to stop illegal logging and land grabbing. This is very important considering that there are 7 million hectares of protected area in Cambodia, which is about 40% of land area in the country. And only 1,200 rangers to oversee this entire system of protected area. That means 5,000 hectares for every single ranger. How come that could be? In Vietnam, community protect forests to ensure a water supply to downstream user for hydropower companies, and are rewarded through the payment for forest environmental services system run by the government. These payments are based on the area of forest the community protect and can be a significant source of income for communities if the forest area is large enough. So if you see these kind of findings, it helps in terms of providing some kind of evidence that how local community need investment. In summary, research find positive outcome for both human well-being and forest condition, where local communities play a central role in forest management and protection, such as when they have substantial influence over decision-making, and when local institutions regulating tenure form a recognized part of good governance. In contrast, when interventions are controlled by external organizations and involve strategies to change local practices and supersede customary institutions, those tend to result in relatively ineffective conservation at the same time as producing negative social outcome like conflict, land grabbing. All stakeholders have the potential, I would say that all stakeholders have the potential to contribute to sustainable forest management and conservation and help the world reach the climate change target in 2030, as Srini mentioned earlier. Local community deserve an equitable seat in the table in any intervention to reduce deforestation and forest degradation, while building landscape resilience for climate change. Community forestry can be a cost-effective approach that countries can take to ensure the meaningful participation and leadership of local community in climate change, mitigation, and adaptation initiative. For communities, forestry to be effective in building landscape resilience for forest ecosystem and biodiversity, while delivering fair benefit to local people, there are some key foundations must be in place. The first one, we have to ensure local communities are located with high quality forests to enhance community livelihood and conservation. Second, they need to participate in decision-making processes to ensure effective governance and participation. Third, they should have clear and strong right over land and natural resources so that they can decide how much they can invest more and what would be the vision for long term for them. Next, as long as they are allowed to develop the livelihood that can benefit the local communities from forest-based products, services, we see the tendency of the successes in investment. The next one, local community need to apply adaptive management learning to plan and adapt, and implementing collective action not only among the community member themselves, but all together with us.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you. And now I'd like to ask Jean-Marc. Actually, building on what Ron has mentioned, actually WWF has been a champion for nature-based climate solutions for a long time. However, as we all know, investments into nature-based climate solutions are much more limited than investments in hard infrastructure related to, for example, energy or transport. So what can be done to channel more finance into NBS for enhancing holistic resilience at COP26 or even the next phase of the Convention on Biodiversity to be held in Kunming next year? Jean-Marc, please.
Yeah, thanks, Srini, and thanks, Ron, for your comments as well. And thank you, everyone, for joining this session. What I'd like to say is, that's a great intro to, Ron's actually intro was great into what I'm going to be talking about, because the focus that I have is less so on how, less so on the actual, I guess you can say, it is on the projects, but it's less so on that. Right now, what I'm trying to establish in this particular conversation is how can we channel more financing for these activities on the ground. Now, we can continue to look for state or government sources of financing, and we will look at that. But what I'm trying to argue, or what we try to argue at WWF using our Bankable Nature Solutions effort, is to channel or mobilize the private sector. So what we want to do and how we're going to do that is we try to make conservation or these type of projects that we're talking about bankable or investable from a private sector standpoint. Because as we, as Srini, as you said earlier, we need to mobilize serious amounts of capital. I just have a graph that I use here that looks at, we have about 1.7 trillion now approximately going into social type enterprise work and environmental work, but we need about 4.2 trillion a year to even get close to where we want to go. So that means we have about a $2.5 trillion gap. I mean, you boil those numbers down a bit further, but that's just broadly speaking. So how are we going to mobilize that capital is where I'd like to focus. So we have about in private sector capital, for example, if you look at mobilizing the private sector, we have 185 trillion in global private sector debt issuance. So that's what's issued, that's what's existing in secondary markets. That is a huge pool of capital. And then we have, you just take a look at global listed equity markets, 90 trillion US dollars right there. And then you look at public debt, 90 trillion. Or sorry, 70 trillion. So there's quite a lot of money out there. So if we can carve out and get some of that or mobilize some of that capital, that will change, I view, the issues that we're currently facing. Because right now we're asking governments who, in my view, are quite strapped for the most part for more and additional resources, which I think they don't really have or aren't really willing to give. So if we can get the private sector or private finance available, then this is what we can look to do. So the idea behind Bankable Nature Solutions, for example, is to, yes, you would initially get grant money, but then you would use that grant money to incubate projects and then bring those projects to the next level where they're ready for private sector investment. Now, the biggest gap I see that's missing, and the private sector has come to us quite often, and this is why we developed the whole Bankable Nature Solutions project, is they have come to us and said, look, we want to get involved in this stuff, but there are just not enough projects out there for us to get involved with. So we've tried to answer that call. And so what we want to do is we are trying to get financing for, and this is usually comes in the form of grant capital, but get financing for the incubation or the discovery or the development of these type of projects, and then get them ready, business ready, get them ready for private sector investment. So just to summarize, all our projects that we go after, they all need to have a strong environmental and social impact. And secondly, they all need to have a business proposition. And then lastly, the other important thing is that to really attract private sector capital at the scale that we need, these projects all have to be able to scale up and replicate at a large number, which, you know, we're talking anywhere between upwards of 100 million or more. So that's where I think, you know, we kind of, you know, then the other part of the equation is that yes, if we do get the money, and we're talking about having all the money here and everything, but the next part is we really have to focus on getting the projects that are going to deliver to this money. You can have all the money in the world, but if there's no projects to get there, it's not gonna.
Yeah.
It's not gonna
Thank
work.
you. And we will be talking more on this private sector role further, but your point is well taken and your efforts are sincerely appreciated. Now, I mean, we will be talking, I mean, but I also want to talk to Dora now. Dora, you are coordinating the forest investment program as well as this dedicated grant mechanism for indigenous people and local communities. So all of us recognize DGM is a very innovative initiative, but basically investments such as DGM are extremely limited compared to the need we have. So can you briefly tell us what are the key achievements and the challenges actually in diverting more resources for initiatives like DGM, which can really help in building climate resilient biodiverse landscapes as well as local communities?
Excellent. Srini, can you confirm you can hear me?
Yes, very well.
Thank you. I'm very, very privileged to be invited as part of such a noble set of speakers, and quite interesting to be going right after Jean-Marc and after listening to Ron. I would say that truly listening to Jean-Marc and listening to Ron, there is that clarity on why the dedicated grant mechanism becomes a critical gap filler. Why I call it so is one, that truly only 5% of the world's population is made of indigenous people and local communities. And to think that indigenous people and local communities manage 80% of the world's forest, and for that matter, the world's biodiversity. And if I may quote from what I have learned, that the issue may not necessarily be lack of funds per se, but the vehicles, the modules, the approaches through which these funds can be directed to the local communities where the actual transformation or where the actual climate action is taking place. These are some of the reasons behind the formation of, or the design or the establishment of the dedicated grant mechanism, which is a means of providing direct financing to local communities and indigenous people. And the DGM, let me also add that it was formed in 2010 jointly with indigenous people and local communities, identifying the gaps in the vehicles or the modules for transfer of funds and ensuring that they can come up with a system that is friction-free, that is able to beat the time lags, but is also able to give them the ability to make decisions on their own, prioritizing interventions or prioritizing investment that meets their specific context, specific goals, also their livelihoods as well as their climate goals. Let me quickly flag 3 pointers, and I believe Ron spoke to them. And these are: one, community-led governance. Whatever form of resources or whatever form of vehicle, it has to be able to give indigenous people and local communities who actually know the intricacies of better management of forest and land assets, give them the ability to make the decisions around the prioritization, around the implementation, the monitoring of these resources. The second point is on decentralization. The DGM model allows indigenous people and local communities to take decisions at the grassroots, at the local level. Here, it also enhances efficiency in resources use and addresses the major question on devolution. In some scenarios, you have so much money at the top, but then what goes on, what really gets down when it trickles down to the grassroots becomes barely minimum or barely enough to meet the targeted needs. So enhancing that efficiency and devolution of funds becomes critical. The third point is on capacity building. It's one thing providing funds, but it's another thing equipping them in the knowledge gaps, equipping them in their implementation and monitoring gaps. And that is one area that the DGM is invested resources. So in partnership with the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, just to name a few, one key point that is quite critical is that Indigenous people and local communities are able to make their own decisions on what their knowledge gaps are, and then have means of resources being targeted to meet these. For example, and I would keep it pretty short, in Ghana, where the focus is on the agroforest or particularly the cocoa forest landscape, Indigenous local communities have found it critical to better understand the agroforest systems as it pertains to shade-loving cocoa species, and therefore have put resources into enhancing their knowledge on that. So those are the three key pointers that I wish to flag on why the DGM is critical in this particular case in ensuring devolution of funds to meet targeted needs at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those insights. I mean, I think that will be very helpful for initiating new programs, and they should take care of this criteria. Now I come to Thomas. I mean, Thomas, you are leading many biodiversity conservation programs at the Global Nature Fund. Again, from your perspective, what are the main challenges and potential solutions to channel more resources for enhancing climate resilience in biodiversity landscapes, I mean?
Thank you very much, Srini and the Asian Development Bank for organizing this important session, for your kind invitation, introduction, and for your question. Good morning to Manila, and good morning to still Sunday evening to San Jose in Costa Rica, where some of my colleagues attend from the other side of the planet, and also good evening to Washington. Well, actually, what we learned in many of our projects is that it's of course important to protect and restore precious landscapes, to save biodiversity, and to store greenhouse gases. However, if you do not work on the causes also of the threats we have on that, you will not succeed in the long term. 70% of biodiversity loss and 30% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide go back on expanding agriculture and recultivation practices. We already talked about deforestation stuff. Also we heard already that agriculture worldwide is still, the major part is subsistence farming. So people really live from their own gardens, they live from their own fields. And in several projects we do as Global Nature Fund with international partners, grassroots organizations mainly, we adopt a combination of traditional practices and the transfer of, let's say, agroecological techniques. This provides opportunities for the people to improve their resilience to climate change on the one hand, to improve biodiversity on the other. Compost is a very simple example for that, which is unknown, for example, in Central America, but a very cheap method to improve soil quality. Our mainstreaming, if we talk about mainstreaming here, and this is what also Dora said, is difficult because people may take their distinct decisions in distinct landscapes, and we really try to disseminate, but getting really into the mainstream, it was difficult for us, at least in the past. Where we saw a huge success of mainstreaming biodiversity and climate change aspects was along the international agricultural supply chains. So something which is produced in one area, for example, in the tropics, and consumed somewhere else, for example, in Europe. Huge business actors in the meanwhile more and more implement such international procurement guidelines and certification criteria. And this is where we currently do a project together with our precious colleagues from the German corporation GIZ in Costa Rica. And I would like to give you a bit short example of what we are doing here. What we try to support is the implementation of useful measures to adapt to climate change and biodiversity on farms and beyond, and to provide guidance, capacity building, in this case with banana and pineapple. At the same time, we do work along the value chains to improve biodiversity and climate change criteria in supply chain management schemes on several market actors and consumers. And we call it farm to fork. You might have heard this as a strategy from the European Union also, but the project is also called from farm to fork. On the farms, we try to work with a tool which is called Biodiversity Check Agriculture. This is an interview and the farmer can understand his connections, interrelations with biodiversity and climate change and pick from the reports and those measures who are really appropriate for himself. So again, going back to Dora and the decisions of the people on the ground, and they can do what we call a biodiversity action plan, what they can implement in the next few years. This can be soil improvement. Sorry?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. I mean, importance of mainstreaming biodiversity in all your operations, both at value chain level as well as at ecosystem level. I mean, it's very, very interesting. I mean, now I'd like to go to my colleague, Narayan. ADB is also recognizing the importance of natural capital for a long time, and now it is contemplating to launch an integrated natural capital innovation facility. So can you please explain very briefly more about this facility and why ADB is contemplating this and what is likely to achieve in mobilizing more investments in this area?
Thank you, Srini. Firstly, greetings to everyone, and thank you for participating in this event. And thanks, Srini, for inviting me to this panel. As you just mentioned, ADB has been recognizing this need for protecting natural capital and growing natural capital for a few years now. And there are several initiatives that ADB has taken. This one is the latest, what we are calling the Innovative Natural Capital Financing Facility. And the genesis of this, is really the linkage, the close linkage between biodiversity and agri-food systems, and the linkage of both these things with climate change. And I think it's quite common knowledge in this forum, at least, how biodiversity loss is being triggered by agri-food systems. So agri-food systems are one of the primary drivers of this. And Asia-Pacific region is actually home to, a majority of the global biodiversity hotspots. And to this extent, addressing this biodiversity loss is critical in the Asia and Pacific, and this is what ADB is seeking to do. So this innovative natural capital financing facility is essentially a knowledge-based solution where we are trying to establish the concept of a catalytic financing platform. It's a three-pillared approach. So the pillar one is a natural capital lab. Pillar two is a natural capital fund, and pillar three is a regional digital marketplace platform. So this whole three-pillared solution is designed to provide a mix of private and public capital to projects with very strong natural capital components, especially in rural areas, with the objective of encouraging sustainable development. So, so what we really want to do is protect and grow nature, natural assets, while at the same time encourage development, trigger development, which is obviously one of the raison d'etre of the bank. So just to explain a little more, the Natural Capital Lab is actually a living virtual platform meant to incubate, accelerate, and expand the natural capital investment. It would leverage existing, environmental accounting tools, try to quantify ecosystem service values of green agricultural value chains. It will also try to strengthen eco-compensation or payment for ecological services mechanisms, and try to incentivize behavior change among both small farmers, small entrepreneurs, larger companies, and provide support to prepare projects, which then can be worthy of investment. And this has an angle to catalyzing private sector investment as well. The second pillar is, of course, the natural capital fund, which would co-invest in projects, also prepared by the natural capital lab, and try to get these projects see the light of day through a blended finance model. The third pillar is a digital marketplace platform, which is intended to make the entire process of the project execution, as well as implementation of these projects much more efficient, as well as enable monitoring of these projects to ensure that natural capital milestones are achieved. Thus, our intention is that the INCFF, as we are calling it, would serve as a catalytic platform to develop sustainable and resilient agri-food systems across Asia and Pacific, which we think is a crying need.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Narayan.
Srini.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I got the name of the facility wrong, but basically this is Innovative Natural Capital Financing Facility. So we hope the facility will mobilize more investments into protection of biodiversity landscapes, as well as supporting the communities depending on that. Okay, I mean, now I want to bring back Jean-Marc actually. I mean, our region, as Narayan has pointed out, I mean, we have a hot spot of biodiversity, and also for climate crisis. We say often Asia, I mean, the war against climate change will be won or lost in Asia. And also some estimates say 63% of the region GDP is at risk from nature loss, and we are losing that. So most people say that why the investments on protection of nature are relatively limited compared to sort of infrastructure, I mean traditional infrastructure investments, is inability of stakeholders to make a strong business case for nature-based solutions. I know that we all have good intentions to bring in the private sector, but still, I mean, what is lacking? What are your experiences in building that sound business case for these investments that can mobilize more private sector, etc.? And how can we scale it up, as you rightly mentioned before?
Right. Excellent. Lining me up for excellent answers for your questions, Srini. Thank you. First of all, you have to look at, like I was saying earlier, I mean, the big gap here to me is the incubation of these projects. So spending money for people, humans, to go out and find these projects and develop them. I constantly talk to, whether it's a private sector funder or whether it's a public sector, they all want to come in at the stage where the projects are already kind of up and running. Well, at that point, I would say, well, get in line. Everybody else does too. What we need is people and institutions to come in and say, look, we're going to pay to develop these projects and pay people to work on this. Now, the thing is, there's no low-hanging fruit. And whether it's in Asia and Africa, I mean, I do agree with you that Asia is the place, but I think that, wherever it is that it doesn't matter. The point is what we need is to get money into the development of these projects. So the big missing gap here is that no one wants to come in and spend money on 18 months on developing something from what could even be as simple as an idea on the back of a napkin, and then coming up with an idea to make it actually a business case. So the thing is, though, like I said, there's no low-hanging fruit, and we continually have to come up with ideas on how to find conservation impact or environmental and social impact, but also make a business case. Now, the easiest sectors to look at are things like forestry, food, some things related around water, but after that, we have to start thinking very innovatively. And of course, there's other ideas on how do we use carbon offsetting to finance these projects. So there's many things that we can think of, but yeah, the answer is that we need to actually put a lot of time and effort into developing these projects. Now, the experience we have is we've been doing this for the last, I would say, 3 years or so since we got financing from the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. We've been working on these projects around the region, actually around the world. But as we found, it's really difficult to get these things, get to a point where they're ready to go in business. So point being is, in order to get and achieve, I guess, the pipeline that is needed for this investment to flow into, we need to really spend the money on the resources to come up, or the people that are coming up with these ideas. And to me, that's the missing link in the whole thing. Until that's done, it's going to be we're still going to be kind of spinning our wheels.
Thank you. I think you nicely summarized the time and effort and the commitment to develop such projects where private sector can really find it interesting to invest more. I mean, building on that, actually, Thomas, I mean, you are working, I mean, you mentioned earlier in Costa Rica and all these investments. I mean, where do you see really, how do we mobilize the private sector to see what is going on in public sector? And also, I mean, what type of enabling environment they are looking for, actually, if we really want to sort of involve the private sector in biodiversity related investments, what are they looking for in terms of public policy, etc.? Thomas, please. We cannot hear you, Thomas, for some reason.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay.
Well, Jean-Marc was talking about business cases, and I fear that very often we will not even find good business cases to involve the private sector in, let's say, protection of agricultural landscapes and of forests. This is a bit what I fear. What we learned in the past is, or what we see in Europe, let's say it like this, is that sensitizing people on social and environmental issues in the last years led to kind of three effects. At first, people more and more buy, let's say, better products. So they tend to grab the more environmentally and social friendly products, which have the specific certification. What we also hear from some companies, the huge players, that people to some extent do not want to work in, let's say, dirty companies. And only very recently, also shareholders and investors get aware of their very particular stake in setting the priorities, let's say, between corporate responsibility and profit. And when this relation between paying few for commodities and selling products expensive gets a bit better for the people on the ground, for the farmers, let's say it like this, we might also see a bit more money in the game from the private sector too. This is what I very much feel. And I very much support this idea of bringing the projects on the ground. It's 14 trillions. If we had that money, what did we with that? It's millions of very small projects. It's millions of small communities. I'm very much with Ronald and Dora with that, who must implement those projects on the ground. And this is a huge task. It's going to be small organizations which cannot digest huge amounts of money. This is what we saw in the past. And this was also maybe Jean-Marc participated a very huge topic on the last IUCN Conservation Congress in Marseille in France 8 weeks ago.
Thank you, Thomas, for pointing out this balance between corporate social responsibility and profit, and also raising awareness on this biodiversity friendly products. Actually, that's consumer awareness is very important in order to mobilize that effort. Narayan, what are your views? I mean, where do you see the role of the public sector in pushing the private sector, or at least mobilizing the private sector investments into this biodiversity, resilience, or local community efforts?
Yeah, thanks, Srini. I think both Thomas and Jean-Marc have raised the issues that private sector normally, look at, and what inhibits them from really investing in these kind of projects, which is, where is the business case? So, and the business case can be generated, in a few different ways. But fundamentally, the private sector investors are really looking for returns. And if the returns are very uncertain, then there is no investment. So really what the public sector can do is try and see how this uncertainty can be reduced. And when you look at blended finance structures, for instance, there are mechanisms that you can use in blended finance structures which reduce the risk involved for private investors, so that they're incentivized to come ahead and try and invest. The second thing is, of course, from a regulatory perspective, from a government perspective, can there be incentives in the form of tax breaks or deferment of charges that governments can bring about? Ultimately, we've seen, for instance, in renewable energy space, that these incentives have worked often. Sometimes they don't work, so it just depends upon the context. But there is a case for looking at such mechanisms to incentivize regulatory mechanisms. The third thing is, of course, I think Thomas alluded to it, or probably Jean-Marc, on CSR expenses, which is again something that regulation is forcing companies to do, private sector to do. But if that is tied up with some form of project preparation help, that goes a long way. And when we are trying to develop this innovative natural capital financing facility, the first pillar, which is a natural capital lab, its main function is actually to prepare projects so that they can be investment worthy. And the project preparation does involve design of eco compensation schemes, or payment for ecosystem services type of mechanisms, which actually elevate the viability of these projects. Of course, there are various other things. The whole sustainability financing market is opening up, and it's a big market. Because that's, again, for private investors to obtain financing is another key bottleneck, and that is kind of starting to get addressed. Let me stop there. I mean, I think.
Thank you, Narayan. I mean, you already highlighted 3 or 4 efforts where it can help in private sector investments. Actually, Ron, I mean, I want to take your thoughts on now the current COP26 is talking about Article 6 focusing on carbon markets. And this has implications for both, because we know that biodiversity-rich landscapes offer both mitigation benefits as well as adaptation benefits. So, but this issue of Article 6 on carbon markets has been pending for almost 6 years since the Paris Accord was signed in 2015. So we hope at least this COP will lead to some successful consensus or a conclusion. So really, I mean, if it really happens, as was mentioned before, the International Emissions Trading Association, they are saying that we can probably mobilize $1 trillion of investments. But this is where I want to seek your views. Actually, what is happening now in COP26 on this Article 6 on carbon markets, and where do you see the way forward? And basically, how can we ensure that this mechanism of carbon markets can really benefit the biodiversity landscapes and also the communities?
Thanks a lot, Srini. When you talk about the Article 6, which is focused more on the carbon project, we somehow that brings the concern among the indigenous people and local people at the moment. I think if all of us follow the COP26, there are many kind of interventions organized by different organizations to highlight the role of IP and LC in implementing the Article 6, especially the carbon project. Well, if you talk about carbon project, where are the lands that are available for the carbon project? Most of the deforested land already been used by different type of people, legally or illegally, just to recognize that. Then when you talk about the local people who live in and around, they bring the concern how much these carbon projects will recognize their rights and tenure. What I would do, well, they bring in the issue about the safeguard. How many of these projects will implement the safeguard if the government not so strong enough? So what I try to say is that if you'd like to see this carbon project work very well, first we have to recognize the local people, right? Yeah, and the second, how can we bring in effective governance by applying the regulatory framework, applying FPIC, applying social impact assessment, applying the social responsibilities of that kind of business. But the point is that the investor, they like to invest in this carbon project. They don't want to wait for long. They're talking about 5 years, 10 years. Can they wait longer than 10 years? So I like to support Narayan mentions that, okay, well, there are so many uncertainty, yeah, from this year to the year 10. So there are many uncertainties. So how can we bring in the, I don't know how you call it, like John Mark mentions about innovative ideas about investment. So some investment need to mitigate risk. Some investment probably can bring the profit. And some investment can bring multiple benefit to the society, not only in terms of the money. But the thing is that the reporting system, validation system, the transaction cost is at the moment very high. How can we get the technologies to simplify the reporting and validation process, to make it simple? And then local people can access, local people can involve in the reporting and transaction. So who should do what? Government, state member need to provide good facility for private sector, banks, investor, yeah, to ensure that they get the return back or to mitigate the risk that Narayan mentioned. So government need to provide good incentive, policy or legal framework to allow this kind of a carbon project to run and serve the benefit of local stakeholder. One more point. I think I'd like to echo what Dara mentioned. Local communities are willing to work together with many of us, yeah, including investor and bank. They need to build capacities. So how can we get enough investment to build their capacity to understand the business language? Yeah, when you talk about bankable, what does it really mean for local people? We have to build their mindset to see, yeah, what are the techniques that they can use? What are the business models that they can apply to bring not only the society benefit, but for their own interest. So just want to share with you, yeah, how to make the Article 6 work on the ground.
Yeah, thank you very much for those insights. There are many challenges, but let us first hope that we will get consensus on Article 6 during this COP 26. Okay, I mean, you actually linked Dora already in terms of how do we really build the mindset of the local communities in participating in carbon markets or adaptation projects, etc. Dora, I mean, we know that forest resources, for example, directly contribute to more than 1 billion out of the 1.2 billion people living in extreme poverty. So the climate change impacts on the forests actually are going to hit the poorest the hardest. So at the same time, you also mentioned earlier, and I also quoted some numbers, very limited adaptation finance is going to address the resilience of the forest landscapes in general and also forest dependent local communities. So here, looking at the experiences of your own, I mean, DGM, and now you are designing this Nature People Climate Program. Really, how do we really want to ensure more adaptation finance can go to these climate resilient forest landscapes and communities? And here again, and what type of private sector interventions can really accelerate such efforts?
Thank you again, Srini, and I hope to keep it brief. I must say with a very fine compliment that this is great learning, this opportunity of hearing different perspectives from really seasoned experts. Thank you. Let me quickly, in response to Ron's point that clearly, although resources for climate adaptation might be relatively smaller. From all indications, there's the need for that reliable, flexible, long-term, sustainable resources that can enhance continuity and the growing lessons and experiences at the local level. And therefore, without belaboring the DGM model, I think if that model can be sustained and replicated, it gives space for that trust and efficiency and ensuring that continuity in interventions on the ground. Because of course, it's one thing starting an adaptive capacity process, and it's another thing being stopped in the middle of it as a result of lack of access to resources. That said, the DGM, as I mentioned, is only one window, but within the bigger climate investment funds, we are looking at the pilot program for climate resilience. We're also looking at forest investment program, and that is just limited to these two. And then, of course, there's the Scaling Up Renewable Energy program. And of course, quite recently, we have new programs added, as Srini is alluded to. And I'll just be hitting on the Nature, People, and Climate program. So what this new Nature, People, Climate program intends to do is to scale up the lessons and experiences gathered from the various interventions in climate resilience, as well as in sustainable forest management, tapping strongly into the dedicated grant mechanism, folding these lessons into what will be the new Nature, People, and Climate. The ultimate goal here is to continue to adopt multi-sectoral integrated approaches to enhancing the capacity of nature-based solutions to climate. And that is where it becomes critical for us to hammer on the value add of using the expertise and lessons from indigenous people and local communities. Very quickly, one point that is always known is that IPLCs seem to be the most vulnerable, but studies have also proven that they have tested technologies and approaches that can be cost-effective solutions to climate, and therefore not just focusing on the conventional approaches to climate action, but tapping into some of these tested traditional approaches that have been well shown to have held them tide over some of the most difficult scenarios when it comes to climate. So I thought it would be critical in this scenario to hammer also on the balancing conventional approaches with the traditional tested approaches. That is where the expertise of local communities come to play. As a last point here, owing to the practical relevance, the cost efficiency of the DGM model, and the new dedicated grants in the new Nature, People, and Climate program, which is a new program in the SIF, the idea is to use the DGM as one of the financing models, in addition to the public-private routes, and then two additional ones, which are climate venture window, and then the private set aside window. The PSSA, as we call it, is designed to ensure that some of the apparent risky climate solutions can be incubated, nursed into bankable, actionable interventions on the ground that can meet some of these needs. So I thought it's quite essential that, again, that yes, we've talked about the dedicated grant mechanism. We've also listened very well to experiences and lessons on how to even strengthen the opportunity for private sector to be better included in the whole climate solutions. And it's also critical to note that in addition to using conventional approaches, which are all well documented, to look more into how we can even support some of these tested, low cost, cost-effective, if I should say, methods adopted by indigenous people and local communities. And I will wrap up on that because Ron has said it too well. Jean-Marc has touched on the private sector and then Thomas also. So I believe that these are some of the ways forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. Thank you. I mean, that last point you mentioned about the private sector set aside of this new program, Nature, People, and Climate. Actually, it will address some of the concerns expressed by Narayan about the risks involved. I mean, people still see this investment as a major, risk for the profit or rate of return. And we hope that the private sector set aside will provide some incentives to cover such risks to some extent, and also build on this DGM and other issues. That's really positive effort. I mean, actually, there was a question from a colleague from Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, Mr. Mata Rao. he was asking about actually who would be the most prominent category of the private sector offset buyer or investor in the case of any community-based biodiversity conservation projects. Any reflections from anyone? I mean, I see that Narayan had initially responded. Narayan, would you like to expand on your response?
Yeah, it's just, my response was first based on data that's been collected by ecosystem marketplaces, which is, been conducting global surveys on this for the last few years. But it's also, supported by, regulators in different countries leaning on the private sector to basically compensate for the damage that their business might be doing deliberately or inadvertently to the ecosystems, to biodiversity, etc. So it's just a reflection of the kind of incentives that private sector companies are being given and how they are responding to it. And these sectors seem to be a little more, you could say, quote unquote, progressive in responding to these incentives.
Yeah, thank you. Any others would like to reflect on this community-based forest management projects or biodiversity conservation projects? Who could be the most prominent category of the private sector? Maybe Jean-Marc, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, Shoshini, I was just going to unmute and to say, I mean, I think it's not so much who, should be or who can be the most prominent buyers. It's basically right now it's where the demand is coming from. And right now, I'm seeing a lot of it is coming from the financial sector. Whether that's good or bad is to be seen. But I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the demand. Also, I'm starting to see there's interest coming from some certain power sector players that are interested in carbon offsetting. So I think, but at the same time, I think it's important that, we take a look at, okay, who are the buyers and who want these? But also, what about the people who, own, if it depends on where the land is owned and who owns it and where they are in this whole scheme of things. Are they just developing it to sell it, or are they, developing it for themselves? So it's interesting to see, to understand that aspect of it too, because right now I'm just seeing, people want to come in and buy these, or buy and hold, or buy and sell. So it's important to know, who on the ground. So I'm looking at a project here actually in Hong Kong, interestingly enough, where the land is owned by a certain private group. And I would imagine they want to keep these carbon offsets for themselves. But at the same time, there's several parties who are interested in buying these. But yeah, I would say, that it's really hard to say like who, would be or who should be the most prominent category. It's really right now where I see the demand, where it's coming from. But I think the usual suspects would be banks or anyone that needs to offset their footprint. But interestingly enough, it's coming from the sectors that don't have a heavy carbon footprint at the moment. And I think the one worry that I see is that banks are looking at these, are buying these so they can then spin these off or basically trade these, or not trade, but flip them into the market and sell them to someone else, or underwrite them and then flip them, which is not necessarily a good thing.
Thank you. I mean, one other aspect that we haven't covered so much in the discussion is about the role of technologies actually. I mean, because for improving the resilience at in an accelerated manner, we also need to think about which technologies are appropriate, especially in the biodiversity landscapes, and also what technologies are appropriate for the local communities to help them protect these biodiversity landscapes. So any thoughts on the role of technologies in biodiversity resilience or local community resilience? Any thoughts? Maybe if I may request Narayan, I mean, just to start off, and I will ask other colleagues.
Yeah, thank you, Srini. I would of course encourage my colleagues to jump in. at any point they think. But essentially, what I've seen is technology is being increasingly used to monitor, the state of biodiversity. I mean, it just follows the old adage that what gets measured gets done. So if you keep measuring and monitoring the state of biodiversity, then you can do something about it and you can conserve. You can grow, protect. So monitoring is where a majority of the technology is being used, and it's also very useful in scaling up. For instance, I think Ron mentioned initially about how there were 7 million hectares of forest land and only 1,200 rangers. So it's obviously physically impossible for 1,200 rangers to really do an efficient job. But if they have technology to monitor, then maybe 1,200 may be adequate, or maybe even too many, because you have all kinds of sensors to whether they are audio sensors, whether they are visual sensors, whether they are heat sensors, moisture sensors. All kinds of sensors are available. Motion sensors, which can detect. For instance, there have been cases where motion of poachers have been detected, and the information relayed to rangers, who've then gone on to make arrests the very same day. So technology is really being used to and it's evolving rapidly to monitor. And in conjunction with that, the improvement in computer-based modeling, simulation, the availability of AI/ML algos to support that is actually increasing the efficiency of this monitoring exponentially. So you have computer models that can be used to not only interpret the data that is flowing through from these sensors, but also to predict outcomes of what might happen to how biodiversity will grow or not grow, depending upon what is being done. And this can also actually be used to improve the application of environmental accounting concepts that that I mentioned earlier in the context of the Natural Capital Lab, to value nature, to value biodiversity. Let me stop there, Srini.
Thank you, Narayan. I think you have. Any other colleagues would like to? Dora, please.
Siri.
Yes.
Can I comment?
Yes, and that's fine. And please, Dora is speaking actually. So I mean.
Okay, please go ahead, Dora.
Yeah, please, Dora, please. We cannot hear you. Maybe while no, we cannot hear you, Dora. So maybe Ron, please go ahead.
No, I'd like to comment back to the previous comments about the offset, the carbon offset. I think among the ASEAN member states, we still have some kind of issues about the carbon offset and how the legal framework support the carbon offset. Example, in Thailand, the offsetting of carbon that appear in Thailand need to be sold or traded in the domestic market only. So for instance, the same with Indonesia, they just issued a new regulation talking about carbon offsetting, and the process to claim the carbon offset need to go through a little bit of high technology. Then coming back to the business sector and technologies, I do agree with Narayan, and I saw many cases that the local people, when they do patrolling, they apply the smart patrol. I'm not so sure that many of you have heard about the smart patrol. They use the GPS, the candid camera, and also linking with the satellite image. So they go in the forest, they do patrolling, they record, they put in their electronic sheet by using tablet and an iPad and so on. They do it regularly. So meaning that the smart patrolling application help them to monitor the forest condition, especially during the dry season. Then coming back to another technologies that we have used in the peat swamp area is called like climatic data monitoring system. So local people can record the wind flow, the speed of wind, the temperature, precipitation, to identify the potential hotspot for fire. So that also help in terms of monitoring the fire potentials. The sector that's supposed to pay for this kind of technology, tourism sector, because if we have smoke and haze, it affects heavily on the opportunity for tourism. Hotel sector, all those hospitality services, they need to pay in order to mitigate the risk, especially during the dry season. Another sector that I have seen on the ground is those organic forest and cosmetic products. Somehow they have to grow those cosmetic herbs, plants under forest shade tree. So that brings in the biodiversity conservation in the area. And another one is the wildlife watch. Well, in Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, in some place of Indonesia, the visitor have to pay quite a lot. I used to pay like almost $200 per day just to see a specific bird. So these type of things has already been exist, but it's just a matter how we can bring these kind of activities into, like John Mark mentions about bankable, and we need more investment to make it proper. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much. Actually, you have nicely summarized also, and there is another question, but we really, Stuart is asking, carbon offsets at the current prices provide much better returns than most farming systems, especially upland crops and livestock, and will major change in upland landscape activities. Will the landowners get these carbon payments, and how will they adapt their upland livelihoods in response? It's a very good question, but I think it was partly addressed also. I mean, the importance of diverting or channeling these carbon payments to the local communities, that is very critical. Because of the time constraints, maybe we will not go in deep. I will try to, because we are already 2 minutes past the deadline. I will briefly, first of all, I want to sincerely thank all the panel members for their excellent insights. And basically, I would like to conclude with the 3 thoughts. We all agree that more financing in whatever way is required if we really want to address climate change and also protect the biodiversity, especially in Asia Pacific, where this biodiversity loss is very rampant. And we also recognize the role of private sector is critical. However, there are also challenges in terms of their risks, etc. So we need innovative financing mechanisms to reduce such risks, something being piloted under the Nature People Climate Program, whether it is private sector set aside or some other initiatives. That is very important to mobilize the private sector. And at the same time, we also need strong regulatory frameworks to really govern the private sector involvement in the biodiversity protection. The third is, I think this is a point that is very well recognized, but it's not being implemented, is the involvement of the local communities in protecting, and how do we really ensure support through both international and national regulations in terms of protecting their resources, but at the same time empowering them in using these resources. And we do hope that the COP26 will lead to a successful consensus on Article 6, so that at least, I mean, some of these resources can be channeled towards protection of biodiversity, resilience, and also local communities. So with those few remarks, because there are so many points that are covered, but I do not want to repeat, and also it's difficult to summarize all. So with that, I would like to again sincerely thank each and every panel member for their excellent insights, and also the participants for offering some questions for further thinking. Thank you all. Again, on behalf of ADB, thank you everybody for participating in this interesting event. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Hope to
Thank
see
you.
you soon. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.